For those of you I don't know, I haven't met, my name's Michael Lestrange and I'm the head of the National Security College, and I'd just like to welcome all of you very warmly to another in our public seminar series. And let me begin by saying that we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we're meeting, and we pay our respects to the Ngunnawal people past and present. In welcoming you this evening, can I say that this event is both timely and important for the National Security College and for the wider Australian community. The issue that we're focusing on this evening, the rise of Indonesia, its future prospects, its relationship with Australia, is always timely. It's even more timely in the period in which we're addressing it. It's also important for the National Security College because we're releasing this evening some occasional papers which have been formed from a collaborative exercise with scholars at the college, throughout Australia and in the region. And it's brought together this group physically and virtually on a number of occasions, and the papers that are being released this evening is a product of that and will form the basis of a publication later in the year. So it's a significant occasion for us, and I'd like to very warmly welcome two guests and one resident, Dr. Chris Roberts, who is on the academic staff of the National Security College and has overseen this project from the start, which has been a complex one and I think a very fruitful and productive one for the college and hopefully for the wider community. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Derry Habir from the School of Government and Public Policy in Jakarta, and Associate Professor Leonard Sebastian from the Rajaratnam School in Singapore. They have both been key collaborators on this project with Chris. They're very welcome visitors here. We've actually been delighted to have them here in the college this week. Worked them pretty hard with involvement in some of the courses we're running at the moment for government officials, roundtables with academics this evening. But most importantly, we're appreciative not just for that involvement, but for their work underpinning this set of papers that we're issuing today. So it's a very great honour to welcome them, and these are established scholars on Southeast Asia with a strong record of achievement and publication. Both achieved their PhDs here at the ANU. In fact, both graduated on exactly the same day. So we've brought them back to the place where it all began. So it's very good to have you both, Derry and Leonard. Thank you very much for your involvement. We look forward to an ongoing relationship with you, and thank you, Chris, for coordinating this project. I'd now like to introduce Chris to explain in further detail some of the origins of this and the purposes of this project, why we did it, how it's come together, and what we hope it achieves. Chris.
Yes, this project is important, as Michael pointed out, for a couple of reasons. First, it is the inaugural suite of issue briefs for the National Security College. Why issue briefs? These are ideally around 2,500, 3,000 word succinct papers that are fully referenced, have gone through a review process, but address and are open to people to submit who want to address contemporary issues relevant to national security in the broader region. As far as the project itself is concerned, the origins actually go back to my participation in Indonesia's Presidential Friends of Indonesia program in 2011. And the stars thereafter seemed to align, bringing Derry and Leonard together for the first time in, I believe, quite some years, and so I've been very fortunate to have such a good team to work with since the end of 2012 through to today, with the different stages of this project. The issue briefs bring together 19 authors from across the region, but a very balanced I think in terms of probably almost close to 50% of the authors are from Indonesia. And we have a good mix of long-established experts in the field, as well as some up-and-coming scholars who have recently graduated. And I feel, very pleased that we've given that opportunity, and some fresh ideas have come about as a consequence of that. The process, as Michael hinted, has been quite extensive. It's involved multiple trips for the purpose of field work by the lead investigators, not just in Jakarta, but also in the region, such as in Singapore. We've had a conference here early last year hosted by the National Security College, and we also had a conference in Jakarta. We've also brought in other people, such as commentators, etc., to review the papers along the process. Indeed, with 19 authors, this has actually grown to cover a broader range of issues than we initially anticipated. In terms of history, our very own Sue Thompson gives a very articulate and succinct analysis of the historical foundations to where Indonesia is and is moving in the future. We have several articles looking at the domestic foundations of Indonesia's rise, both in terms of the opportunities and the constraints to its future rise as well, such as economic considerations, the political environment, such as Dr. Stephen Sherlock, somewhere here in the audience, the nexus between politics, security and defence, an analysis of security fault lines or unresolved issues, as by Robert Lowry, also here in the audience. At the regional and international levels, we have an article looking at the nexus between democratic values and foreign policy, how that has informed foreign policy. Also, the Indonesia's normative priorities, including, as one of the authors, Derry Habir, over there, and also Indonesia's role in international institutions such as the United Nations, the non-aligned movement, and the G20. Leonard has also contributed to a paper and a later chapter on Indonesia's maritime interests. There's also an analysis of possible collaboration by Indonesia with other democratic middle powers. We have another article on Australia's relations with Indonesia by myself and Derry Habir. We also have a paper on Indonesia's key bilateral relationships in the region by the ANU's Yongwook Ru, as well as another paper on Indonesia's leadership in ASEAN by Alina and myself. Finally, we have a paper by Associate Professor Seng Tan from Singapore on Indonesia's current and future relations and influence with the great powers. As Michael mentioned, this will lead, a larger version of the papers you have before you, will lead to a 17-chapter edited volume with Palgrave Macmillan to be published at the beginning of next year, submitted to them by June this year. Before moving on to the presentations, with Derry providing the first, last and by no means least, I'd just like to thank Martin and George for all their work and leadership in managing the activities for this week, and especially importantly, Michael Lestrange and the National Security College for providing us with the opportunity and the funds to conduct this research project. And on that note, I'll pass over to Derry Habir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always good to be here back in where I struggled for a long time. Initially, Chris asked me to write about the economic side of our project, which was actually written by Satish Mishra. And since I'm not an economist, I gracefully slided into or nimbly slided into a topic of recent concern in Indonesia, which is economic nationalism. We're very much in the news because of the the ban on mineral exports. The nimble side of it can be changed to smart economic nationalism or strategic economic nationalism. In essence, though, Indonesia has been lacking in those attributes in terms of its economic nationalism, but I hope to give some context in which why there is that economic nationalism. I start out with, this is taken from Thomas Lindblad's article on paper on bird's eye view of decolonization in Indonesia, and it quotes Haji Agus Salim, who was foreign minister when that was made. I think around, if I'm not mistaken, around 48 or 49. If it was 48, it was my birth year, but that was after the independence, but political independence. But of course, what he's saying is that the economic independence has not been attained. And I think that underlies much of the motivation, much of the urge for economic nationalism. Now, nationalism in general has always had a bad name to it, a negative connotation. And almost automatically when people talk about nationalism, unless they are very pro, obviously, it connotes something that is not positive. And in terms of economic nationalism, it connotes a self-destruction of economies all over the world. However, when you think about countries like Japan, Korea, even the United States, there could be an argument that economic nationalism in the beginning would have been something that would have contributed to their development up to a stage where eventually free trade would have been considered. Free trade itself could be considered in the national economic interest of a particular country. And countries, those types of those countries have been probably more consciously, certainly more consciously than I believe in Indonesia, have actively done acts of economic nationalism. Here is one from a close neighbor of yours that apparently have not allowed China to buy up land. This one is from Denmark, selling its green competency, a more attractive design than the previous one. And of course, I've always been impressed by Australia's patriotism in its products and businesses. When it comes to Indonesia, however, you have, of course, a rather negative look at economic nationalism. If you look back at one of the first people who thought about economic nationalism, Friedrich List, he actually focused, even though he did advocate protectionism, infant industry, he focused on the nationalism part of that two-word phrase. So that he argued that it was important at that time to put the nation in questions of economics and not just focus on the individual or on the broad humankind. He, some of those early economists considered free trade, for example, as being the bringer of worldwide peace, for example. So if we look at it in that context, we can think that there may be a flexible use of economic policies as long as it contributes to the national interest and well-being. Now, Indonesia may well pay the price for its economic nationalism, but at the moment, we are talking in the context of what we hope, at least, will be Indonesia's ascent. And the first sentence is almost a mantra spoken by many Indonesian officials, including SPY, and this was, of course, spoken by SPY, President SPY, in the Australian Parliament. He was actually, in relation to Indonesian-Australian relations, he was quite vocal about the need to change things with regard to the relationships, but he was trying to give the context of why that change would be needed. And part of the reason of the recent economic nationalism, many people attribute to the fact that during the time that we needed a lot of assistance from the IMF and the World Bank and other agencies at the time of the Asian crisis, this particular picture did not play well in Indonesia. And there are still some people thinking that we should, again, going back to Haji Agus Salim's quotation, trying to get away from that dependence. And probably today, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, Indonesia has not been a basket case, like in the days with Gunnar Myrdal, Benjamin Higgins, and there are a set of circumstances in Indonesia, granted, and we will talk about them, that these are in the context of many things that are not favorable to Indonesia's ascent, such as corruption, social unrest, etc. But by and large, this has given a confidence that has not been, I feel, not been felt in a long time. I've never seen this before. In fact, I've never seen this until I tried to find something that would show that of this confidence. So this is the context of what we are facing going into the future. And of course, the future includes, we just had the legislative elections, and the future includes these two people. Now, in terms of the decolonization of the Indonesian economy, when you look back, Prabowo Subianto's father was trade minister back in early 1950s, and a trade and industry minister in the early 50s, and he was the architect of, among others, the Benteng program, which was meant to it favored indigenous or pribumi entrepreneurs, which was a spectacular failure. But in the 1980s, when he was, I think at that time, was a senior advisor to President Suharto, he proposed that he was one of those who strongly proposed the deregulation of the Indonesian economy. In my institute, when we had the first commencement of the school, he addressed us, and that was the second speech after he gave a first speech in the University of Indonesia, of the need for deregulation at a time when there was a lot of political opposition to it. So I think that is an expression or an act of the flexibility that one is needed in terms, even if you're talking about economic nationalism. Now you have Jokowi, who is he has to keep the the legacy, or he doesn't have to keep, I hope he doesn't keep, the legacy of Sukarno in terms of the economic policies, the economic nationalist policies, where that was approaching autarkic policies such as the slogan Berdikari, that was independence or sustainability by the country, and that actually all those the policies by the Sukarno regime were not productive, to say the least. However, I should mention that this next quote, please don't take it as my personal endorsement for Prabowo Subianto. This is a quote, a recent quote from an interview. I'm considered a strong economic nationalist, but I'm also a realist. It should not be done in a way that backfires at you. The goal is improved prosperity. He was talking in response to a question related to the ban, the mineral ban. And this, in a way, reflects his father, even though I don't know whether he, in fact, looks at his father in that way. So let me go back to the quote of Haji Agus Salim. But if we consider economic nationalism, Robert Reich in his book the State, I think it was the State of Nations, said that economic nationalists should move away from protectionism, but that they should the government should play an active role in the investment of education and infrastructure. You can add to that health, you can add to that technology. And I think that is what is needed in the future in Indonesia. I think we need to reconcile the democratization of Indonesia with, and it's not necessarily, but sometimes it is difficult, with the need for long-term strategic planning. Now, I seem to have run out of slides, so I will end my production. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to see all of you here today. I know that you must be suffering from Indonesia fatigue by now, considering the number of events that the ANU has hosted on various aspects of Indonesia, either leading up to the elections or as we lead up to the presidential elections. So full marks to all of you for turning up for yet another seminar on Indonesia. It's such a pleasure to be here at the ANU. I was here from 1992 to 1994. I remember my experiences vividly, but one of the nicest things about being here in Canberra is that you have such a wonderful collection of scholars who work on Indonesia. The range of scholarship here is quite astonishing. When I first stepped into the research school of Asia-Pacific Studies, I think as it was then called, I was amazed at just the number of people working on Indonesia in the various departments, centers, programs, study groups. So it was a real education for me, but more importantly, it laid a real solid grounding for me to study Indonesia. Of course, I had to return back to Singapore to continue work, but I made sure I at least managed to see my beloved Canberra Raiders lift the Winfield Cup. Watched the match on television and followed the victory parade, and even had the opportunity to shake hands and have a chat with Mel Meninga. But unfortunately, it looks like they've gone downhill since I've left. So maybe I should stay here longer, it's a pity, but then again, there's always the Brumbies, right? They seem to be doing much better. The ANU has produced outstanding research, on all facets of development relating to Indonesia. From year to year, we in Singapore are astonished and struck by the range and quality of research produced here. For my colleagues at RSIS, the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and of course myself as the coordinator of the Indonesia program, the ANU is really the benchmark for measuring excellence, particularly for our work on Indonesia. Hence, it's a real pleasure to participate in a project on Indonesia hosted by an outstanding institution, the National Security College here at the university. So I want to thank Professor Michael Lestrange for supporting this project and my co-editors, Chris and Derry, for working with me. It's especially nice to work with friends. This is an important project. And let me tell you why it is a critical project for us to take note of. The issue briefs and the edited volume that will follow will plug a gap in the research on Indonesia conducted here at the ANU. In fact, what it will do is it will position the National Security College and the ANU by that extension as a significant research center for this particular research, a significant research body for work on Indonesian foreign policy. Over the years, I believe the ANU has fallen behind a little, particularly with respect to research on defense, security, and foreign policy as it pertains to Indonesia. There is considerable expertise within various government institutions here in Australia on Indonesian foreign policy. However, the think tanks and universities in Australia have fallen behind in this particular aspect of research. So what I hope this volume will do is that it will produce research that will not only be useful for academics, but will have solid policy relevance. The series of issue briefs come at an important time. Indonesia no longer exists in a benign security environment. Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa's use of the term dynamic equilibrium, while vague, does to some extent describe the existent strategic dilemma faced by Indonesia as it strives for strategic autonomy in a region plagued by trust deficits, territorial disputes, and strategic change. As an increasingly disjointed ASEAN, spluttered with its member states being tugged in several directions by politicking from within and external power plays from without, ASEAN centrality has been called into question following changes in the new security environment. The first is the rise of China. Its growing investments and the climate of interdependence it has created in Southeast Asia creates a challenge for member states. The other aspect is the build-up of its naval capabilities. The second is the countervailing pivot, or the rebalancing efforts of the United States in its Asia-Pacific engagement. The third are territorial disputes in Southeast Asia. None of Indonesia's neighbours can assume that its foreign policy will remain unchanged over the coming years. Jakarta will redefine its regional role as its relative wealth and power grows. More importantly, it will redefine its role as the region itself changes under the influence of the rise of China, the emergence of India, and of course, its attendant implications for the role of the US and Japan. We will undoubtedly see over the coming years a changed Indonesia. The last 5 years of the Yudhoyono presidency had revealed an Indonesia more confident and more assertive. Strategically, they have become more active on the regional stage, but increasingly operating very much as an independent power in its own right. Questions still abound over its trajectory. Will a more confident Indonesia be more inclined to assert its interests? Would Indonesia be harder to deal with and more inclined to assert what Indonesia believes are its interests? It is our hope, then, that these issue briefs will begin the debate and prompt further research by scholars. What is evident in this collection of issue briefs is essentially a wide range of topics that we hope scholars and students will follow up on, specifically in the areas of the influence of domestic factors on foreign policy, the nature of norms and values that shape Indonesia's foreign policy outlook and how they impact on foreign policy as a whole, the ideational tools that will shape Indonesia's foreign policy, particularly its engagement with institutions like the United Nations, the G20, and the non-aligned movement, issues relating to the law of the sea and maritime sovereignty as Indonesia looks to define more coherently its archipelagic principle, concepts like the Indo-Pacific and Indonesia's engagement with like-minded middle powers, specifically its relationships with Australia, South Korea, and India, the role of ASEAN and key relationships with its bilateral partners, and of course, Indonesia's relations with the great powers. The book to come will also feature research on Indonesia's foreign economic relations. This will, we hope, be a comprehensive volume on Indonesian foreign policy, and perhaps it'll be one of the first in-depth study of foreign policy approaches in Indonesia conducted since the post-Suharto era. I'm certain it will stimulate debate and further develop research agendas on the topic, but more importantly, research on this topic will be of value to the policy community. Thank you.
I thought, given the location, we couldn't have a talk on Indonesia without at least some emphasis on the Australia-Indonesia relationship, which has been part of the work that Derry and I have been doing. So I've just got a short, review of some of the key issues that were identified during our research for the topic. And I'll just start with why perhaps Indonesia should be deemed as particularly important for Australia. Obviously, there is the issue of proximity. Some talk about, a buffer state to the north, but I see the fact that Indonesia is only separated by 240 kilometres of ocean from the top of Cape York as being particularly relevant in terms of the common sort of security challenges, the new sort of security agenda, non-traditional security issues, rather than, say, a traditional security threat, which has been, a concern in some quarters in past decades. That is not, of course, something that Indonesia has ever entertained as an idea, nor has it got the capacity in terms of a blue water navy. But on the non-traditional security side of the coin, Indonesia's stability is, continued stability into the future, is critical to Australia's security. Significant instability domestically could lead to many issues. The current situation or debate over irregular migration would pale under a worst case scenario. But also in terms of Indonesia's capacity to combat crime, to which the destination point, say with illicit narcotics, could be Australia, and perhaps already has been. Pandemics, and many other issues. But Indonesia's role as sort of the natural-born leader, as the first among equals within ASEAN, also provides an important gateway for Australian diplomacy, especially to the extent that we can work with Indonesia for common goals and objectives. And of course, as ASEAN has engineered its exogenous institutions for broader engagement, be it the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN +3, or the East Asia Summit, that nexus, that bridge via Indonesia will be increasingly important. Economically, this can't be, I think, overstated. In terms of purchasing power parity, which is what you get for your dollar, perhaps the most important measure, Indonesia's economy is now 30% larger than Australia's and continues to grow faster than Australia's at this uncertain period in the global economy. Indonesia's middle class is now larger than the entire population of Australia. The complementarities for future economic growth, however, are strong. From its own mix of natural resources, our natural resources, and advantages in terms of access to labour, demographics in terms of a youthful young working force. The reality for Australia is that Indonesia will increasingly, from this point, some point in the last decade, we've hit a juncture where Indonesia will be increasingly the larger, stronger power, all things being equal, as long as there's no retraction in its gain, than Australia. And it's for these reasons and many others that getting Australia's relationship with Indonesia right is absolutely critical. Now, within Indonesia itself, and this ties in with its broader foreign policy, etc., there have been some very significant developments that tie in with the reformasi process and the consolidation of democracy. Certainly, there are still problems. I'm not suggesting everything is perfect, but nonetheless, just to take a few examples, if we look at in the aftermath of the devastation of the December 2004 tsunami, which didn't just affect Indonesia, but was devastating in the Aceh region. And we compare Indonesia's response to that of the State Peace and Development Committee in Myanmar, the Burmese junta, following Cyclone Nargis. You couldn't see stronger polar opposites. Indonesia, under the leadership of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, not only welcomed foreign aid, unlike Myanmar, but even permitted and allowed and enabled foreign militaries to also assist in the recovery and reconstruction efforts. If we also look at Indonesia's shift in regional diplomacy, we see an approach that is increasingly complementary with perhaps Australia's approach, only perhaps in some ways even more engaged. So in the wake of Cyclone Nargis and Myanmar's refusal to allow aid in to the country, many of us are aware of Surin Pitsuwan's diplomacy, less are aware of the fact that in a foreign ministers' meeting, the Indonesian foreign minister allegedly leaned across the table and, actually slamming his fist on the table, asked the foreign minister of Myanmar what he thought ASEAN membership meant to Myanmar and what, at that time and in those circumstances, Myanmar's membership meant to ASEAN in terms of ASEAN's internal coherence and international profile and its membership shared vision for the future. The implications of this was clear that Myanmar's membership in ASEAN was at stake, to quote a number of officials, including an ambassador in Singapore. And it's in this regard that we see greater activism on issues like human rights. As the Director General for ASEAN, DEPLU, or now KEMLU, once stated, I believe, on this issue, non-interference, we are more open now. Indonesia is more open, more flexible because of the democratisation process. And perhaps one of the most exemplary examples concerns Indonesia's proposal for a security community, particularly if we look at its draft plan of action. Now, in that plan of action, there were 75 concrete steps for the realisation of a security community with fixed dates for implementation, not your traditional sort of ASEAN way. This included a human rights commission with teeth, not what actually eventually evolved, but even a regional peacekeeping force standby mechanism. And if you look at the Indonesian approach, and Marty Natalegawa was very much involved, as was Rizal Sukma, in terms of the early advice on this approach, we can actually see a vision for the region that had complementarities with Kevin Rudd's Asia-Pacific community. And as we know, that did not get much traction. But this is where I think that Australia needs to have a kind of reorientation in perspective on how we look at Indonesia, because had perhaps the then Prime Minister approached Indonesia first, built a consensus, got Indonesia on board, and perhaps stated that we share your vision for Southeast Asia, cannot certain aspects that are complementary to the APC be enlarged for the broader region? I think that sort of approach, very much an ASEAN approach, would have gained greater traction. Nonetheless, it did lead to a debate, and there was a positive outcome, perhaps more through coincidence than planning, and that was the expansion, or the beginning of the East Asia Summit and the expansion of the East Asia Summit to include the United States and also Russia as the 17th and 18th members of the EAS. And we also see Australia playing in the broader regional dynamics. Australia has played its own role in encouraging stronger Indonesia-US relations. This is something that I believe, under a democratic identity, and also given the kind of things Leonard had mentioned in terms of dynamics in the South China Sea, China's rise, etc., will mean that Indonesia itself will increasingly find it difficult to keep its kind of non-aligned position, particularly if the actions of other greater powers fundamentally contradict its emerging values and its approach to foreign policy. But certainly in terms of political values, again, emphasising the commonality or the trends, the growing complementarity between Indonesia's worldview and Australia's worldview, the emphasis on human rights, for example, institutions such as the establishment with President SBY and other key leaders on the board of the Institute of Peace and Democracy in Bali. The language of the Institute's name says a lot. The focus on human rights in the region, the emphasis on dealing with aspects of transnational crime, the Bali process, irregular migration, people smuggling, human trafficking, the willingness of Indonesia to work with Australia's federal police and other agencies in what has been an amazing success story, the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, JCLEC, which has led to several hundred arrests and convictions on terrorist-related matters, but also something like 52 countries have now participated in its training courses. These are not insignificant achievements, and these follow on the back of other developments such as the Lombok Treaty, the 2010 Strategic Partnership, the 2012 Defence Cooperation Arrangement, which, according to then Foreign Minister Stephen Smith, kind of put, or in paraphrasing here, put meat to the bones in terms of guiding cooperation under the Lombok Treaty. In line with efforts from both sides, we've seen coordinated maritime patrols, a bilateral peacekeeping exercise, critically officer training, through the bilateral defence cooperation program, such as what takes place at Western Creek at the Australian Defence Force Academy, high-level regular dialogue, such as the Foreign Ministers and Defence Ministers, the 2+2 annual dialogue. And through to 2013, we saw statements by senior politicians that defence and security cooperation had reached the highest level in at least 15 years. Unfortunately, as we all know, not everything has been a positive picture, and I say through to 2013 deliberately. We had the Edward Snowden leaks and the dampening of the bilateral relationship as a consequence of that. The allegation or the leaks also concern, for example, intelligence intercepts of not just SBY and key ministers, but also, for example, the President's wife. There was also the apology by Australia's Prime Minister over incursions, stated unintentional incursions into Indonesian territory, but given the rise of GPS or global positioning technology, etc., the unintentional statement has been perceived, perhaps with certain question marks, by many in Jakarta. A key problem I think that we also face is, and this is not just in Australia, but also in the broader region, a tendency to resort to populist policies, to look politically at the next year, the next 2 or 3 years, but very few visions of 10 or 20 or 30 years. That's not always the case with some countries on that point in the region. And when I say a decline of bipartisanship, which was something I can remember attending in the 1990s in Australian politics and being taught about, because the stakes are so high, how traditionally there has been a degree of bipartisanship. But while we always expect debate and vigorous debate in a democracy, where are the policy blueprints for, the 10-year sort of strategic plan with Indonesia, the white paper or other documents? And it's one thing to replace as they are updated, but from many people's perspective in Asia, there is the archival of them may be misperceived as a rebuttal of the importance of Australia's engagement in the region. I would like to think that that is a misperception. Of course, one of the problems with populist policies is that is also interdependent with the socio-cultural level of engagement, to the extent that some statements are made that may offend on either side, whether it's Indonesia or Australia. A lack of mutual understanding amongst the masses at the grassroots level is highly problematic. Fortunately for Australia, one thing that has been reaffirmed in my travels and also through my Indonesian colleagues and friends in Canberra, including my various students, that amazingly what we might be very self-conscious of in terms of various issues like the cattle problem, through to more recent developments, say, over intelligence, has not actually, intercepts, has not actually gained that much traction beyond the English newspapers, such as the Jakarta Post. Perhaps this may reflect a degree of pragmatism in the sense that the current leadership has perhaps tried to avoid allowing this to be a nationalistic issue in the hope that things can be resolved and that a full rapprochement can be made. But the other important pillar, which links to Derry's, some of Derry's remarks, is the trade dimension. I remember meeting with Ambassador Greg Moriarty on a couple of occasions, and every time he stressed that all good, solid dependable, long-term relationships are underpinned by significant trade. And through trade, you have interaction. And through interaction, you have mutual understanding and strengthened relations between societies. And this is perhaps the biggest challenge and gap in the Indonesia-Australia relationship. So just in terms of my final slide, what is needed, I think no surprises here in terms of resolving the outstanding diplomatic issues, coming up with some form of MOU as has been discussed, and finalising that in terms of certain boundaries regarding intelligence. I do see a need, maybe in certain sectors, maybe for certain politicians, maybe for all politicians, to have some form of mandatory training on diplomacy and regional affairs. I thought that would get a reaction, but being Asia-wise, having more knowledge about Asia will be key to putting us ahead of our other competitors, many other countries in the West that will be seeking to also make use of Asia's economic rise. And it's not so different to the ideas of universities such as the University of Southern Queensland in the 1990s, where it didn't matter if you were going to be a scientist or an engineer. You would, as a compulsory process, have to undertake one subject called Australia, Asia and the Pacific. So every student who graduated from that university left with at least a basic understanding of various political, cultural, historical elements in our immediate neighbourhood. The strengthening of the economic relationship, moving ahead in terms of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Partnership, but also educating, such as what Greg Moriarty has already been doing with exchanges for journalists, etc., and educating journalists and key stakeholders on investment opportunities in the country. As of last year, he talked about something like only 130 or 140 companies, actually Australian companies operating in the country. A really positive side of what Australia has been doing has been our aid program. Indonesia has been the largest source of, or the largest country for Australian aid, and in turn we are the biggest provider of aid for Indonesia. The exchange programs that I mentioned before are critical and need to continue, and I'm pleased to see that there seems to be no change there. And we have the new Colombo plan, which is also important in bringing Australians out into the region to also have a broader and deeper, not just understanding, but set of relationships that can hopefully build and grow over time. But perhaps to some extent the cart is before the horse, because there also needs to be as much, if not more, emphasis on Asian language training. And the fact that New South Wales, as of a couple of years ago, was down to 86 people in Year 12 studying Bahasa Indonesia is highly disconcerting. 1,100 students nationally studying Bahasa Indonesia at the tertiary level in 2011. 6 universities have closed their Indonesia programs since 2004. That is a dangerous trend, and once you lose the teaching capacity, it takes a long time to get it back. And that is my final point, the long-term investments, not just in Asian language, but also in Asian studies. Approximately 2% of Year 12 Victorian high school students in 2009 studied history course with any content on Asia. I myself, as a graduate in the 1990s, learnt primarily about things such as the Roman invasions of England, and I certainly did not learn anything about Asia until I was lucky enough to meet a Thai lecturer in my undergraduate studies. So I hope I've provoked some thoughts and questions for the discussions that follow. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris and Derry and Leonard, and I think through those perspectives and insights they've opened up a lot of issues that people may wish to pursue, or any particular issues that they've not opened up. Feel free to do so now. Before we start, I should just mention to Leonard that although these are sadder days than when you were here for the Canberra Raiders, we have managed to maintain their colours up here in the National Security College, which is quite fortuitous, but I'm quite proud of that. And one day, the sun will rise again, I'm sure. Okay, so let's have the first comment, perspective, question for any or all of our panel. And there's a microphone here, so he's going to break the ice for us.
I guess this question is probably for Dr. Habir, but maybe something the rest of the panel would like to comment on. We're moving from a period in Indonesia where there's been a very internationalist president, who has reached out into the world and had a very large figure in the world, and we're moving probably to a point where Joko Widodo will become the president of Indonesia. I kind of see him as an Obama-like figure, a man who has great charisma and has been elected for that, but I don't really get a sense of what his foreign outlook would be. I wonder if you could give me some idea of what that might be.
Not sure at all. I think there was he's a very smart, shrewd person. The one indication I remember was he hosted the international mayors or Southeast Asian mayors of Southeast Asian cities in Jakarta. And I think he was not uncomfortable in doing that. He speaks relatively, okay English, and I think more than anything else, it would be circumstances, external circumstances, national circumstances that would force any president to react to international events, for example. I think Leonard can talk a bit more about the other. You assumed Jokowi as president. I think there still is a very interesting election coming up, so we don't necessarily have to give him the crown yet. And I think Leonard has an interesting perspective on Prabowo.
Thank you for your question. Jokowi is going to face challenges initially in his first 2 years. He is a very intelligent man, as Derry has highlighted, very shrewd, very decisive. I think the way to describe him is he is very much like Suharto in his operating style. But of course, Indonesia is a democracy now, so he will be constrained by the environment. But the fact remains, he's someone who will gather together advisors, listen to their advice, and it has to be really solid, practical advice. Typical shrewd businessman, and he will act on it decisively. But it has to make sense to him. But of course, in matters of geoeconomics, geopolitics, he still has a lot of catching up to do. So it will be a challenge for him in the first 2 years. But I suspect it will be similar to Suharto's situation in the period, say, after 1967, where he was basically listening to the technocrats who gave him advice. But by by 1970 or even the early 1970s, he was the one who started giving advice. So what Jokowi will do is he will surround himself with able people. I think you will see different groups of people who will support him. One classic example would be, say, CSIS, who are positioning themselves to become Jokowi's advisors. But also, don't forget, the vice president will play a more significant role. He will operate more like a chief of staff. This will allow the vice president a certain amount of, I suppose, certain amount of latitude, to take part in WTO or G20 type events to support the president. So there will be that element. things are now very much in flux. I think if we thought 6 months ago that it would be a sure win for Jokowi, it's not going to be that straightforward. He's got an almighty fight now on his hands. He's still in the ascendancy. Of course, by that I mean he's still the odds-on favourite. But when you look at his polling numbers, it's starting to drop. The real issue is, you have to look at the goal put. 34% of people didn't vote in the elections. So these people may turn out, and the likelihood also would be a lot of people would have preferred to vote for someone that they feel represents political Islam better, may actually vote for Prabowo. So there is actually the political Islam vote that could swing in his direction. Also, the PKB will be split, no doubt about it. If it was united if it was more, sorry, the word I should use is coherent. If it was more coherent during the general elections, it will change now, primarily because Roma Irama is not going to be fronting their campaign any longer. Yeni Wahid is close to Prabowo and will draw some of the Nahdlatul Ulama vote in that direction as well. Also, everyone has forgotten about our dear friend SBY, right? He hasn't decided where he's going to hedge. So remember, that's 9% of the vote, right? Democrat Party. So if he decides to throw his weight behind Prabowo, that's the whole weight of government behind him. It's a very significant game changer that.
Could I just add a short something that you mentioned internationalists as SPY. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Foreign policy, they say, starts at home, and I think Jokowi or even who knows, Prabowo would focus domestically, and if that turns out to work, become a bit more stable, then that provides the base for an active foreign policy.
Okay, any other issues? Maybe down the front here, maybe here, and then we'll go somewhere in the middle. Yeah, sure, come to you next.
What are the implications for Australia's relationship with Indonesia if Prabowo does win?
I think that's for the audience to answer. No idea. There are, I think if Prabowo does win, I don't think there is implications in what sense? In other words, is he going to attack Australia? I don't think so. I mean, actually, any president that's coming in is, in a sense, hopefully will take it as being a mandate from the voters, and we have now a regular 5-year cycle, and so consequences will be thought about. Frankly, I don't think there would be any clear or say. In other words, what I'm talking about is that the reaction would be more from the foreign community than it would be from a president, including Prabowo, than from domestically. But maybe the others could share their point of view.
Thank you. Yes, Prabowo has to take Australia seriously. Means Australia is an important partner and simply cannot be ignored. I think the bigger issue is how Australia receives him more than anything else, because of the human rights issues that surround him and have crippled him from time to time. So I would say he does have strong nationalist tendencies, but the question is, we don't really know whether this is rhetoric that he, plays to the gallery in order to drum up support in the course of electioneering. Remember that nationalism always seeds under the surface in Indonesia. It doesn't take much, right, to trigger it. So I would wait and see, because he will also have to deal with the same problems that Jokowi would when he becomes president. He's got to look very carefully at the government's revenue base. My sense is the government's revenue will be stretched quite significantly over the course of the next few years. So they have to think rationally about how to deal with fuel subsidies and provide adequate funding to deal with some of the more pressing problems that they face, particularly in terms of food security, in terms of proper health care for the population. These are all huge issues that need funding, and he has to be pragmatic. But of course, the bigger problem with him as compared to Jokowi is he's unpredictable. And that's the problematic side of it.
Thank you. If we were to have an Asia-Pacific community, what vision do you have for its architecture? And I was wondering whether you envisage following the European community path.
Yeah, it's I think the problem with the Asia-Pacific community, apart from getting the concept of it, apart from launching it in the right and way and getting people on board, this is something that, for example, was achieved with the ASEAN security community idea. It was one thing to get a consensus even amongst the 10 ASEAN countries, but the realisation, the implementation is the challenge, and that is very much interdependent with the vast diversity of not just Southeast Asia, but in East Asia at so many levels, cultural, religious, all the great religions intersect in Southeast Asia, but diverse strategic alignments and associated with that animosities, tensions and competition, Japan and China, South Korea and Japan, and many others. And especially in as far as an EU type model is concerned, then that makes it even more, a more remote prospect. For an EU model to even be applicable to the region, you really would need to finalise a process of internal consolidation, positive pluralistic nation building, enough economic capacity, less of a gap on that side, and really, I also believe common values, and that may debatably even include common democratic values. And we see the fracture taking place in the region, very much the new Cold War type divide is, those countries that are, with exceptions such as maybe Vietnam, those countries that are more authoritarian find it easier to deal with China, to get aid, investment, and benefits from China. Those countries that are either democratic or have at least convinced, say, various key Western players that they are making bona fide changes, such as Myanmar, etc., are getting a lot of support and shifting and alignment. And so we see actually quite a close line, with one or two exceptions always as a generalisation, of political values lining up with strategic alignment, and that's fracturing ASEAN and the region down the middle, and hence why the APC, and especially not an EU model, is foreseeable or feasible in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Just a follow-up to that, I was wondering,
Yes, that's a very good point. I think economic cooperation, collaboration, integration is a very different story. The problem with the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the question of who's in and who's out. So it's not necessarily a unifying process within the Asian region. But the important dynamic in this explains why, for example, the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint is literally 3 times the size in number of pages and detail compared to, say, the ASEAN Security Community Blueprint. It's so much easier in relative terms, at least in terms of your aspirations and rhetorical agreements, to agree, because if you're democratic, you're representing your people by progressing on the economic front. If you're authoritarian, you get regime legitimacy by bringing back the goods. So that becomes far less sensitive, and hence the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, etc., and even things like enhanced dispute settlement mechanism. So quite institutionalised developments, or relatively institutionalised developments in the economic sphere. Thank you.
I thought there was one in the centre, just the back there, and we'll come down here. Up there, Martin, and then we'll come down to Martin.
Thank you. In addition to Chris' points in that slide, in order to improve Australian relations with Indonesia and also with Asia, I would like to suggest reorientation or redirection of Asian Century White Paper, because that paper, I believe, focused very much on economic relations, socio-cultural relations, but less on diplomacy, foreign policy relations. For instance, Australia this year hosts the G20 summit, but there is not much engagement with Asian nations, including Indonesia, to discuss what Asian aspiration towards G20 and also other issues such as climate change. There is not much effort from Australian side to engage Asia in multilateral issues. Thanks.
Thank you.
Down the front here, just there, that one, first lady there.
I'd just like to hear your views looking ahead in the future. Pick 5 years or 10 years. Is Indonesia still non-aligned?
Future is unpredictable. I was just going to say that we're talking about Indonesia's ascent. A crisis could happen somewhere down the line, and all bets are off. And essentially, we need to prepare long term. But then again, prepare for what? But I think the foundational side of things will need to be taken care of. If you're talking about if we're talking about long term, the needs for Indonesia are education, health, infrastructure, technology including innovation. If now to your question of whether they will be non-aligned, I think the dynamics of how they get to that point in terms of those areas might influence whatever shift there are. In other words, if China comes in with a lot of aid in certain areas, I was mentioning not China, but I was mentioning Sweden coming in with a life science institute with high technology, a joint venture. Those types of advances might shift. However, I think there are other Indonesians here. I would say that, in principle, non-alignment has had a very strong hold on foreign policy. It will take quite a lot to shift it. In particular, it would take a lot to shift it to treaty types of arrangement. I think multilateral arrangements would be much more suitable. By the way, ASEAN Economic Community, it's coming up into 2015. I think Indonesia is totally, well, I shouldn't say totally, but is quite unprepared for the consequences of that. You know, that's not going to get them to shift to one of the, I think Leonard might have a different viewpoint on this in terms of the geopolitics of things, but if 5 years would be potentially, say we have Jokowi as president and he's going to have a second term, that's 10 years, honestly, I don't think there would be any particular shift. It's the same thing with, even more so, with somebody like Prabowo.
Sentimental links with the non-aligned movement, yes, but I think in terms of its utility as an institution for Indonesia's foreign policy requirements, I think that will start to diminish over time. The philosophies are still important, though, for Indonesia. I mean, if you think about it, bebas aktif, mendayung di antara dua karang, I mean, these are all drawn from or inspired by the non-aligned movement principles. So I think from an ideational perspective, yes, but Indonesia will still be part of the non-aligned movement. But whether it sees any utility in it, that'll be, I think it's quite unlikely. There are a lot of new institutions that have superseded it. I think more importantly for Indonesia, the G20 is going to be a very important forum. That is where it'll engage a host of middle power states and forge more common linkages there. Mm-hmm.
There's a lady just in front of you, I think, with a question.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess just to add very quickly to those different points, yeah, I think, for example, the behaviour of China will have some role. And this links to the earlier comment I made on the South China Sea. It's interesting to note, in practical terms, I'm thinking here, and I agree that the sort of the values or the emotional side will continue, but in practical terms, we've seen in the last few months the Indonesian military stand up and say, for the first time publicly, that China's 9-dash line conflicts with Indonesian interests and territory. That had been a very useful diplomatic device previously to say that that they are not a claimant state and therefore could act as a neutral party for negotiating. And I'm sure that doesn't necessarily represent the entire Indonesian security community, but we're seeing a fracture coming. And depending on, given developments in Vietnam or between China and Vietnam, and the Philippines' statements about possible runway construction by China, depending how that goes, and there's a lot of other issues domestically that could affect, but all things remaining equal with Indonesia, depending how things go with China will be important, and also because now the US can engage in the sale of weapons, etc. That's also a important supplier, and the defence relationship is building. So it will be interesting, and I do think that Yes, and I do think the sailing between two reefs and not getting too close to either will at least become more difficult from my own perspective anyhow. So.
Hi, thanks very much. I have a question to just pick off on the very last comments Chris was making in his speech as an ANU undergraduate student of Asian Studies. I'm interested in the commentary about how even though there's been a push towards increased Asian studies and Asian languages, there isn't a match-up with the graduate jobs for people who have studied Asian languages and Asian studies in Australian universities. So I guess my question is two-pronged. First, what kind of jobs do you see are available for young Australians who are graduating with Asian studies and Indonesian language majors? And secondly, how competitive are these kinds of people compared to young Indonesians who speak fluent English?
No, some very good questions to put me on the spot there. I think, firstly, the problem at the moment is that there is not the funding. For example, if you learn an Asian language and become fluent in it, there are not the job opportunities, even say within teaching, to move on. And so this is where there needs to be a comprehensive, well thought out policy in building up not just learning about languages, but in turn also opportunities beyond that. Certainly, I would imagine if Australia continues to reorientate in terms of its investment and trade, and of course Asia is now collectively the bulk of Australia's trade, then one would expect or should expect in the future, if companies are on the ball, that people who are sort of Asia literate as such and have the language skills, etc., will serve and are serving a very valuable purpose in private industry. But there are still, sadly, a lot of missed opportunities in the sense of, say, jobs in education, the number of maybe ANU has been a bit of an oasis, but most of the Asian studies programs and the strong political departments that even extended out to regional universities, such as James Cook University in the 1990s, are all but gone. And so until those things and many other things are addressed, then yes, there'll be a gap between supply and demand, etc. So, very good question.
We could have got on for a long time there. We've only got time for one more question, which I'll have to ask to be brief and some brief responses before we can get you out the door, as we promised. So the last one will be just to...
Thanks. The panel has talked about a range of issues of Indonesia's outward orientation, G20, ASEAN, bilateral relations with China and US and so forth. Nobody yet has talked about the issue of orientation towards the Islamic world. I'd be interested just to get any thoughts that you may have. Whether Prabowo Jokowi presidency might be different in that regard, or whether you have any thoughts about the general ideas that have an Islamic influence in foreign policy.
Well, I think the days, thank you, Stephen, for that question. I think the days that the Islamic agenda could be divorced in a straightforward way from foreign policy are over. I think bottom-up pressures are very significant and will shape foreign policy making. I think one has to look at the foreign policy making process to get a better sense of how these things work now. There are three dimensions to foreign policy making now in Indonesia. You have non-state actors that are very influential in shaping the discourse. They may be people representing Islamic groups, or they could be special advisors to the president, who can have a word about a word to the president about putting Islamic issues at the forefront. I mean, the institutional position of Kemlu is more restrained, and that's what. But the Kemlu is one element. The third element is really the office of the president, and you have foreign policy making there as well. I mean, we saw it quite clearly with Dino Patijalal and his initiatives within the president's office, which took Indonesia in new and uncharted territory, areas that weren't traditional areas that Kemlu, the foreign ministry, emphasized. But more importantly, I think we have to go back to my earlier point about the non-state actors, the people now outside the system who have the ability to influence the foreign policy process. There are times Indonesia can insulate itself. I think we saw that with the voting patterns relating to sanctions relating to Iran. But I think now issues relating to Palestine or some of the more contentious issues pertaining to the Middle East, it's very difficult for the government to no longer put an Islamic cast on foreign policy. Suharto was very successful in separating the two. But Indonesia being a democracy now, there are those pressure points that the government has to be responsive to. So Islam will be on the agenda, no doubt about it.
I broadly, I agree with what Leonard was talking about. But I think also there's a gap in our knowledge of actually how the policy making is being made, whether it's just a gap that we need to close to understand just broadly any of the policy making mechanism, if there are that, in both informal as well as formal. And so, yeah, just to highlight that that gap.
I'd like to thank Leonard and Chris and Derry very much for the insight and breadth they brought to their scene-setting remarks, and also for their responses to some extremely probing questions, which I think drew a lot of these issues out in a very, very clear-sighted way. So I'd like to thank them for what they've done tonight. I'd also like to thank them very much for all of the work that's gone into this project over a long period of time, and for the National Security College. This is an important benchmark of international cooperation in terms of our research output. I think it addresses a critically important area of public policy for Australia in a way that is informed by expertise and intellectual coherence. So thank you to Chris and for his leadership of it, and to Derry and Leonard for their vital support from the region. It's been great to have you with us. And I'd also like to say that it would be great to get them back later in the year once the presidential elections have been and gone, and we can get some retrospectives and see how your projections really did measure up. But whichever way it happens, whatever may result, the implications for Australia are highly significant, and your perspectives will be very greatly valued. So I hope this is a connection that we can continue to build on as far as the NSC goes. And finally, can I just thank you all again very much for your attendance and support of these occasions. They're tremendously reassuring for us that there is an important constituency out there with an interest in these things, and we're very delighted to bring them to you. And I thank Martin and all his team, and George and others at the college who work very hard in making these logistics work as smoothly as possible. So thank you for your support. Look forward to the next occasion, and a safe trip home. Thank you.